I'm Warren Smith with World News Group, and you're tuned into the latest edition of our new Christian Voices series. In this program, we visit with writer and theologian Dr. Anthony Bradley. Over the past few years, Anthony Bradley has been a significant voice in helping the white evangelical church understand and reconcile with its black brothers and sisters. He's also been a part of a movement sometimes called Young, Reformed, and Black. Anthony Bradley teaches at the King's College in New York City and is a fellow with the Acton Institute. He's also the author or editor of a number of books, including Liberating Black Theology and Black and Tired. We began our conversation by talking about how he came to embrace Reformed theology. Anthony Bradley, let's start by just talking a little about your upbringing. You were raised in Atlanta, right?
Right. I was raised in the southwest part of Atlanta in a great church. And I was raised in a community of people who had sort of been the first generation to have the benefits of the end of Jim Crow down south, and they really invested a lot in us, and was also really influenced by my parents, of course, in a very supportive home, in a very stable community, very stable neighborhood. But also the Boy Scouts was a really, really important part of my story early on. It was where I first learned leadership. I was in a really, really fantastic troop, and that really gave me opportunities to sort of test out some of those early gifts.
So you had a successful Boy Scout and school experience. You graduated from high school and went off to Clemson.
Exactly. So near the end of high school, I became an Eagle Scout, of course, as all good Scouts do. And then I matriculated into the best university on the face of the planet Earth, also known as God's University, Clemson University. And I majored in biology there because I wanted to be a medical doctor. And it's interesting that I was really caught up there at Clemson into sort of thinking about what it would mean to be a really wealthy, well-known physician. And as I began to process through, I had a group of friends who started to take me to two college ministries. One is Fellowship of Christian Athletes, also known as FCA, and also Reformed University Fellowship. And as I continued there, I had this encounter with Christ, and I realized that I actually didn't know him in the ways in which I thought I had, and began to follow Christ, and that's where everything changed.
Well, Anthony, today I think one of the reasons you're known is because you are part of this emerging movement of African Americans who have embraced Reformed theology, young, black, and reformed. I've heard it sometimes described, and you've been one of the leaders of that movement. In fact, you've written several books, related to that topic. And I guess Reformed University Fellowship was what first allowed you to understand Reformed theology. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It was because of Reformed University Fellowship and the friends that I had. I mean, we would sort of hear teachings, but then my friends would talk about it right over meals and also with Bible studies that I got this first introduction to the doctrines of grace. And that's where I understood for the first time the ways in which God saves us by his grace and empowers us to be his people by his grace as well.
Well, one of the things that we're discussing in this film series is how people discover their vocations, how they answer the question, what am I going to do when I grow up? You were at Clemson to become a medical doctor, and you encountered theology, you encountered Jesus in a personal way, in a way that you had never encountered him before. It changed your vocation, it changed the trajectory of your life. How did you decide? What was the process? I'm assuming those steps were part of the process, but what was the rest of the process that took you off to seminary and a PhD and ultimately to where you are today?
Great, that's a great question. So the journey and the pathway included, really for me, it wasn't really a plan. I've always been the type of person who sort of stumbles into things. And what I found is that as I was leaving, as I was sort of getting ready to finish at Clemson, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I had some friends suggest that I go to seminary, and I thought they were crazy because no one in their right mind goes to seminary, right? And I listened to people. I listened to people that I trusted, and I went to seminary, and it was there that while I was there, I got exposed to youth ministry and other parts of the church. And as I was there, near the end of that, I was really debating if I should be a Christian school teacher, or youth pastor, or do a PhD. I'd had these academic aspirations, but wasn't really sure. And there was a professor that I had there by the name of David Jones, who pulled me aside one day and said, hey, Bradley, you should think about doing a PhD. And I had thought about it, but I wasn't sure if I should do it because of the tendency for us to chase idols and want to be famous and things like that. So I had really decided that I wasn't going to move in that direction until there was some sort of external confirmation. Someone else had to encourage me to do that. And when Dr. Jones pulled me aside, that really opened me up to considering doing a PhD.
So, Anthony, you ultimately did get a PhD. You ended up at Covenant Seminary in St. Louis, where you were on the faculty, and you were also leading the Francis Schaeffer Institute there.
Because I had this interest in not just theology, but the way theology intersects culture. It was sort of a part of my church upbringing. It's fairly common in the Black church, sort of think about the way theology applies to social and cultural issues. So the work of Francis Schaeffer, the Francis Schaeffer Institute, was really, for me at least, was a natural fit.
Anthony Bradley added a robust understanding of economics to his theological training. He cites economist Thomas Sowell as an early and ongoing influence. But he also has another somewhat unusual influence.
I was really in love with this show called Family Ties. And there was a character on the show, Alex P. Keaton, and I really wanted to be like him. I would dress like him. I brought a briefcase and took it to school and wore ties. And I started watching the shows that he would mention on the show. One of the shows that he mentioned was Firing Line. And I would watch that show, and that's how I got introduced to William F. Buckley. So I became a Buckley fan in high school, where none of my friends were reading Buckley. And so I've always had this interest in politics, always had an interest in economics and free markets that started way back then. And then I encountered my graduate degrees in theology, and it wasn't until I found the Acton Institute where I discovered that you could merge an interest in political economy with the interest in theology. And for me, politics and economics and theology all intersect on the issue of human flourishing. So how do we think about the moral, the economic, and the political context that create the conditions for human beings to really flourish? Those things don't happen in isolation. They actually feed into one another. And so for me, those things are actually work in concert together to produce people who can live and be free.
Anthony Bradley, even though you personally have this interesting history that has led you to a place where you are African American and Reformed and biblically conservative in your theology, and a free market, a believer in free markets in terms of your economics, you've also been fairly critical at different times of the evangelical church and the conservative movement and the way it addresses the African American community. I know one of the conversations that you and I had some years ago that has really stuck with me. You know, you say that a lot of times we conservatives talk about sort of the evils of big government, and you even agree that big government can be bureaucratic, can be impersonal. It can. We've got plenty of examples from history where it has been tyrannical. But that a lot of folks in the African American community were able to rise out of poverty and into the middle class because of jobs from the government. And that when we talk about the evils of big government or the need for limited government, that message gets heard in a very different way in the African American community. Is that fair to say?
It is fair to say. I always encourage some of my more conservative friends who care about markets and limited governments to understand that in the Black experience in America, we had a different experience with government. And so government, at least in my family, I've seen, was the means by which we were actually able to enter and stay in the middle class. Both my parents, my father worked for the post office, my mom worked for the public school system in Atlanta. And so it was because of those institutions that we were actually able to have a fairly decent life. It's also important to keep in mind that at least in the late 60s and the early 70s, it was those big government programs that provided the first opportunities for scores of African Americans, particularly in major cities, to have opportunities to sustain very, very good jobs that they wouldn't have had opportunities to do otherwise.
Anthony Bradley, we're in an interesting place in American history in terms of race relations right now. We've, 50 years after the Voting Rights Act, in an era where Jim Crow is in our rearview mirror and now receding in our rearview mirror, and yet we still have situations like Ferguson show up. And it seems to create an environment where some people say, of course, that we still have racism in America. Of course, situations like Ferguson are going to arise, and yet there's just an equally strong reaction from others that a situation like Ferguson just comes out of the blue. They're blindsided by it. They're shocked by the emotion, by the visceral reactions that we're seeing there. Give us your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's interesting to remember that every local community in this country has a history. And that what we saw in Ferguson, of course, was probably the last straw being broken on the back of a historical narrative in North St. Louis that most of us just didn't know about. So that area has a whole history of really tense race relations that date all the way back to the 1940s and 50s. And what we saw was sort of the residual effects of that. I also encourage people to remember, particularly Christians, to keep in mind that the fall happened, right? And so as long as we have humans working in institutions, we're going to see sin. And so I've never been one to say something like, there's still racism in 2015 because, well, there's still sin in 2015. So, of course, we're going to see racism in 2015 as well.
Well, in fact, I've heard someone say it may have been you, I just can't remember now, that what we have is not a skin problem, but a sin problem. Is that, when you hear that, how do you react to that?
I would say that we have both a sin and a skin problem. It's really not either or. I think what we see today is they operate differently. What's interesting, I would argue, is that we need to sort of think more strategically, more broadly, in terms of thinking about ways to define what it means to be human, and that's really been something that I think Christians can really add to the conversation. That these issues between races and classes has a lot to do with how we define the very basic structures of what it means to be a person. And that's probably how we're going to get sort of move forward from these sorts of issues, is to really think more concretely in terms of what it means to love other people because they're people. And that's what Ferguson needs. That's what New York City needs. It needs a context by which people are brought together on the basis of love and solidarity and unity because we're all human beings. And that's something that Christians should be speaking more about. I think that's also what happens within the context of racism and classism, is that we begin to see the other as not human. And that legacy, I would say, of the civil rights movement is something we need to carry into our conversations about Ferguson and about New York and about any other part of the country where there's any tensions by race and class.
As we near the end of our time together, I asked Anthony Bradley this: if you could give advice to a predominantly white church that wanted to deal more effectively with race issues, what would you tell them?
I encourage people who are concerned about these issues to think about what it means for us to share racial solidarity. And racial solidarity is a means by which we pursue coming together for the purpose of being united in our communities, because we're all in this together. How do we bring our specific and particular differences, our issues, the past, the grievances, the hopes, dreams, aspirations, how do we bring those into a conversation about moving forward because we're in this together? Racial solidarity means that we recognize, because we're different, we need to figure out a way to work together in our communities to make those communities the kinds of places that allow all of us to flourish and mutually help one another.
Can you say a few words as someone who maybe, and I don't know about your childhood in Atlanta. I was raised in Atlanta, but I'm a good deal older than you, and I know it was a really different place. But I can imagine that as a black boy, a young black man growing up in Atlanta, you probably experienced some racial slights yourself. And you have had to perhaps forgive people that never asked for forgiveness. Sure. What is the role of forgiveness in this process?
That's a right question. So I would argue that forgiveness provides us an opportunity for healing and for restoration of relationships, restoration of a vision for what it means for us to be a united people in our communities and in this country. Forgiveness means that we recognize that we are all equally sinful and broken. We all have proclivities to think incorrectly. And we're going to give people space to recognize the ways in which they failed at thinking properly about themselves and properly about others, but then use that forgiveness as an opportunity to move forward together.
Anthony Bradley, here at the King's College and in other aspects of your life, in other arenas of your life, you're working with young people. A lot of them are kind of trying to figure out what it is they want to do when they grow up. What advice would you have for those people?
So my advice to those people would be to try things out and fail at them. I often encourage my students to embrace failure. Sometimes we discover things that we might not have known about ourselves by failing at something. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes we have to do things to learn that we don't like that we don't like that thing. And I encourage my students to just try different things out, sort of as God encouraged Adam and Eve to explore the garden. It's yours to enjoy. So I encourage my students to enjoy the creation, try different things out. And if you don't like them, if you fail at them, that's fine. It's just an opportunity to redirect and further crystallize what it is that God might be calling them to be and to do.
From his position as a professor of ethics and theology at the King's College in Manhattan, Anthony Bradley continues to teach, write, and, play his congas and eat. That's right, two things we didn't talk about is that Anthony Bradley is a musician and a self-described foodie who had a ready list of restaurant recommendations for this visitor when we filmed our conversation in New York City. Reporting for World News Group's New Christian Voices series, I'm Warren Smith. Got it? Great. Anthony, man, thank you for that recommendation last night. The food was fantastic.
You hungry?
I am.
All right, let's go.
Let's do it.